Hey class, we're on chapter 7, the Roman Empire. You're going to want to be reading your book and you want to keep up with the reading schedule in the syllabus. It's a pretty exciting chapter. A lot of what we find out in Rome kind of applies to ideas of now with democracy, their worldview. It's getting interesting in the ways in which it's kind of one of the chapters, including ancient Greece, that's the foundation of Western civilization. A lot of our ideals are based off ancient Greece and Rome, and then getting into the next chapter, Byzantine. We'll see a lot of this stuff that applies to things in our world now in a more direct way than maybe the prehistoric era or some of the other things we've been looking at previously. It feels like, oh, it's so old, I don't understand how there's any value in this. For some people, I find value in it no matter what, but because of a lot of other ideas about what it means to be human, how we create things, and the way we look at the world, and how it's all based on history and the histories of those things. But this is a chapter a lot of people seem to like, and we're going to be looking at a lot of interesting work, architecture, sculpture, just a bunch of different things that are, and some historic events like a eruption of a volcano. So pretty interesting stuff. So welcome to the Roman Empire. There's going to be quite a bit of comparing and contrasting. Their expansive empire, and maybe we could say the world's greatest ancient empire, the ancient world's greatest empire, went at some point from all the way up in like Scotland down to like over Egypt. This is a huge empire. Rome in the center of it here, but they took over a large amount of the territory around the Mediterranean. And they had a huge impact on civilization. Latin languages are all based out of Rome, speaking Latin. Their building and the way they built roads. There was a time, and there's a quote that says all roads lead to Rome, because at one point Rome was the center of the Western civilization world. So roads all across this area would all lead back here. There's many things about them, and they have kind of a long history. We're not going to go into every section of it because there's about 1,000 years that their empire lasted for. The first part of it was kings. Then there was a republic, and then the republic was done away with emperors and empire. So sometimes a bit confusing there. I want you to watch the documentary, 24-minute one about this. Rick Steves, he shows you a lot of these places. We talked a bit about the myth of Rome's origin because I showed you a piece in chapter 8 called She-Wolf, or Capitoline Wolf, which was two twins suckling underneath a she-wolf. That was a girl. So the origin of it is that Romulus kills Remus, his brother, over an argument of the auspices. And if you remember what the auspices are from chapter 8, they're the reading of the will of the gods and the flight of birds and animal entrails. And he builds the beginning of Rome on Palatine Hill. There's 7 hills in Rome that we'll look at later, but Palatine Hill is one of them. And he becomes, in essence, the first king, followed by 6 kings, some of who are Etruscan. And this is these are the twins that suckled on the she-wolf and were survived because of that. There's, some idea that approaches historical truth, and the first kings of Rome were probably Etruscan in some way. And then later on in 509 BC, the Roman Republic was established when the last of the kings was overthrown. Later, the Republic will go away and we'll have emperors, but this was really a heyday for them. This is a huge influence on our modern day democracy because it had something similar in a way to an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. So the separation of powers like we have in our government. So we had the consuls were like the monarchical branch, or we could say executive. then we have the aristocracy, Roman government, and then we have the assembly. So there was different parts of their legislative branch. So there was different part of their legislative branch. We had part of it that was inherited power. This is kind of like the British monarchy versus the House of Lords and House of Commons. This is like elected, but they not shown on here is the judicial separation, the branch of government, and that was a really important system as well on our, you could say, on British law, and then our law is based off British law because legal system that you were innocent until proven guilty, and an automatic appeal of the death penalty for citizens. So this is a pretty big deal compared to other parts of the world and history before this. If the king wanted you to be killed, you were killed. Now, we say for citizens, but not everyone in the empire was automatically a citizen. It was a special status. So this is something important to realize. There's not necessarily social justice for every person. Now let's go a little bit into this. Consuls were elected every year, and they shared military and judicial authority. So they're in some way kind of the judicial branch. The Senate was former magistrates and people who had, aristocracy this is like people who are of the wealthy class. And this assembly is of citizens. So they're not necessarily inherited, I guess you could say, more like people who are part of a ruling class. The political supremacy of this lasts around 500 years. Like the heyday of the democracy is 500 years. Compared to Athens when they had a democracy, that's a lot longer. Athens was like 50 years of their heyday of democracy. This is a pretty long-standing democracy. The city and the empire were a melting pot. They weren't necessarily culturally unified like Greece. And there's in some way maybe a genius to this because it allowed them to encompass and govern and assimilate different cultures. They let people bring things into their system, not necessarily become citizens, but have a way of being able to rule over them without being so set on an exact way everyone had to be. What I mean by that, a better way to say it is, Greeks thought everyone who wasn't Greek were barbarians. The Romans thought if you weren't Roman, you were a barbarian, but they were happy to assimilate you in some way. And eventually, later laws made it easier for people to become citizens who hadn't even been to Rome. So there was a way in which they could assimilate even very different cultures. This kind of shows you a bit more of the breakdown of different people in power, senators, patricians. They were part of the magistrates. We have things about consuls and how they managed armies. We had praetorians who were judges in the law. They could become governors of provinces. So there's different kind of stages. Down at the very bottom, the plebeians, tribunes were representatives of plebeians. You had ordinary people and then slaves. There was slavery in the Roman Empire, so they weren't like full of social justice. For them, Rome was the center of the world, and they thought of it as the capital of the world. We have at some point the rise of Roman power happening after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, and then this large empire that I showed you a picture of that stretched from Mesopotamia to the British Isles, and wherever the Roman society went, their legions, their armies, they took their culture with them. They took their laws, their religion, and their Latin languages with them. So this is a pretty big deal in the way that it unified and brought certain parts of the world's thinking together and the languages. We have this situation where there is the Republic. Then there is a period where there's three different people sort of in charge. I'm not going to go into all the details. A civil war, and then Julius Caesar ends up in charge. And then in 44 BC, he is assassinated because they don't want a king. So there's this whole process going on here. Eventually, this guy, Octavian, who renames himself Augustus, ends the Republic in 27 BC. So we're talking about not long after Julius Caesar was assassinated. He was defeated and he was a powerful general, and he becomes the first emperor. Um, he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in a civil war, which is based on all this stuff that had been happening with Julius Caesar's assassination. And he began to dismantle the republic. And it's the start of imperialism, so an emperor and an empire. A version of this actually lasted up until 1453 with the fall of the Byzantines in chapter 10. And we'll get into the kind of how that transition works much later. But his reign as emperor was a peaceful and prosperous period known as Pax Romana, Paxromana. And it starts in 27 BC and goes to the next period of time, 30 to 40 years of his rule. Now, Octavian or Augustus is a really interesting figure. We're going to look at some sculptures of him. This piece is called Augustus of Prima Porta from 100 AD. It's 6'8" in height, so we're talking about a little larger than the average person's height, kind of getting a little bit, showing his sort of size to be his important, larger than the average person, grandeur. It's called Prima Porta because it was found near a gate of the same name. It functions as a piece of what we would call political propaganda. So it has a lot of narrative going on it. We're going to unpack that. The little boy at the bottom here, holding on to him, is actually a strut for his legs, and it's also Cupid. So it's a creepy little Cupid down below, I like to say. You can see it there as well, how this strut holds him up. And this is important because Cupid is one of the Greek gods that they adapted to their own iconography, their own system as Roman. We'll see here at the bottom, Zeus, they renamed Jupiter, but he's the same. Poseidon's Neptune. Apollo keeps the same name, and on and on. So Cupid is a way of him actually equating himself with the gods. Augustus claimed that his authority came from the gods, and that he said, a quote, "My power comes from the gods." And he also claimed he was an ancestor of Venus. Okay, this is really important because this is also on this strut a dolphin, and Cupid is riding a dolphin. You can kind of see it here. It's very difficult, but there's the fin right there. So Cupid's riding a dolphin, and Venus is supposedly the dolphin. So he's claiming that his power comes from the gods, he's related to the gods, and he's using symbols of gods connected to himself. Now, Roman religion had a worship of emperor and state, and they adopted also local gods from different areas. This was common to them. So it's very important for them. The image of the emperor and his position in religion was really, really deeply ingrained. In some way, he kind of mediates between the people and the gods and the will of the gods. And we'll see that this later on becomes a big, big, big issue in chapter 10 with the rise of Christianity in the empire. So the Roman gods and goddesses are mostly identical, as I said, to the Greek gods. We're going to look in detail a little bit at some of the things on the actual figure of Augustus. So this is made out of marble. It's in the round, so all the way around it you would be able to see. It's in a contrapposto pose, his hips being at an angle are covered over a bit by his robe. But you can see from the straight leg and the bent leg that it's using that Greek style of contrapposto. And it's pretty much anatomically accurate as a picture of a person, albeit it is very much idealized, what we've talked about with other statues and sculptures from the Greek era. Now, he has a very much of peaceful, calm restraint on his face. We're going to pick up here on video lecture number 2 on the baton of power missing and some of the other details. But we'll stop right here and then pick it up on the next lecture. I'm doing these in 15-minute sections, so I'll stop here.